I want to bring Mike Benz. He's the executive director for the Foundation of Freedom Online. Mike Benz, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you, Liz.
All right, Mike, before we dive into the tangled web of NGOs, Armed Queers, and who they're associated with, where they're getting funding, what they might have done, I want to ask you a question that I think is on a lot of our minds in these days since Charlie Kirk's murder. And that is, you know, it's been a long time in our country since we saw a political assassination like that. I mean, I think the last time we saw that, this significant of a political assassination was in the 1960s. When you are analyzing what happened and what motivated it and the reaction, the celebration from the left, the gaslighting from the mainstream media, what do you see? What are the implications? Do you think more assassinations like this are coming?
It's quite possible. I think everyone in this space with a large, loud microphone feels it. I mean, you hear left-wing influencers like Destiny proudly going on Piers Morgan, and I believe the quotes were something along the lines of, "This is a good thing because right-wingers need to fear talking in public." And then I think there was another quote that was something to the effect of, "Well, if you wanted Charlie Kirk to live, then you shouldn't have elected Donald Trump as president the second time." And these are folks with millions of followers, daily live streams. Charlie was a unique target of these online communities for a very long time because he was the most trusted person. I think a YouGov poll showed that Charlie Kirk was the single most trusted public figure for young men under the age of 30 years old. And Charlie not only built with his own hands the institutions on college campuses that young people on the left had to confront for ideological hegemony. There was nothing before that. College Republicans was always a joke. Turning Point completely changed the game, and Charlie was not only the face of Turning Point, but Charlie was a tall, cool as a cucumber figure who would walk right into the lion's den, take on 25 people at a time. I think the Jubilee video for Charlie Kirk going up against 25 college leftists is at 35 million views right now on YouTube. He never lost. He was completely unflappable. And not only that, because he was so successful and so good at it, both institutionally and linguistically, it emboldened young people of Gen Z to speak up and aspire to be that eloquent, that influential, that proud and confident of their own beliefs. And so Charlie was singularly targeted by these online communities. And I think it's worth noting that this kind of assassination culture on the left, I think another YouGov poll showed that 25 or 26% of the far left endorses or is okay with political violence or assassination, whereas it was like 3% of the far right. I mean, it's like you're talking orders of magnitude in difference here. And I think a lot of this is because of the fearlessness, because there is a hard-edged far right, or at least there was, maybe you could argue, a decade ago as part of the primordial soup of the Trump movement. There were these groups like the Atomwaffen Division, if folks remember, and these kind of really crazy out there far right groups, but they were neutralized very quickly by the Federal Bureau of Investigations and the Justice Department. They were any group that even dared to utter half of a fraction of what the online left does today was so quickly infiltrated and entrapped by federal government operatives from the FBI, the DHS, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Justice Department, that nobody anywhere on the right would go anywhere close to anyone who even suggested in coded language the stuff that is said by the online left out loud. The concept of Fed posting is something that looms very large, I think, in the online right, which is that everyone knows that if someone were to call for the assassination of a Barack Obama or a Joe Biden or or an online left influencer or the like, anyone who goes anywhere close to that language is not only socially shunned, but immediately called a Fed, because only Feds talk like that on the right. And we've seen so many of these just sweeping operations to take down any of these networks. And a lot of this is because the way the FBI defined domestic extremism, the way DHS did, the way our intelligence community did, the way our law enforcement did, was to define domestic extremism as a right-wing phenomenon coming from domestic paramilitary adjacent extremist groups. And it was effectively verboten to change that definition to include the left side of the political aisle. And not only that, you had institutional capacities built up within civil society to go after that. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of federal grants to university centers, to NGOs, to civil society organizations, to map the online right and to triage by extreme level. And then they functioned as essentially another arm of the Justice Department and the FBI. The SPLC would create these hate maps of hate groups. They even put a bullet sign, a target over these groups, and labeled TPUSA one of them. While the SPLC was partnered with the FBI and DHS to essentially serve as the extended investigation arm of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. And so the online left never really had to go through that process of purging its extreme elements because of the intense focus of law enforcement on it. And I think that has led to this wildly disproportionate level of restraint on the right and complete mask off, open fearlessness to Fed post. Although when they do it, it's not even Fed posting because they're not even apparently monitored by the Fed.
I mean, I don't think anything, unless it has not yet been reported, I don't think Destiny suffered any repercussions for saying that conservatives should be assassinated. I mean, I remember seeing a poll, this is a couple months ago. I remember seeing a poll about how many leftists thought it would be okay if Elon Musk was assassinated. And it's one thing when you see a poll. It's another thing when you see these leftists celebrating an actual assassination that happened, the murder of a father and a husband, the murder of Charlie Kirk. It's horrifying. So part of the assassination culture is exactly what you described. Part of it is that they have networks of these groups, whether it's Armed Queers. I mean, I'll be very interested, as the FBI is, to see if they had any foreknowledge of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, this Discord chat, who these people were, what they knew, or what they didn't know. But talk to me about what we do know right now. I mean, when Armed Queers, Salt Lake City, traveled to Cuba, there's a video, and I want to show this on the screen. There's a video of them saying, if we are terrorists, then we're proud to be terrorists. Can we play this, Benz?
Every class of Cuban society thinks like an organizer. And these students, who were regular medical students, they came and spoke, and basically what they were saying was, they were wearing their white coats, they looked like medical students. They were like, we're the reason that America's calling Cuba terrorist. And they were saying, well, if we're terrorists, we're proud to be terrorists because we're sending doctors around the world. And if that's our terror, then so be it, yep. Right? But here's this little island a couple of miles away from America, 90 miles away from America, and they have a president who talks like us. They have a president who understands the need for a liberated Palestine. And I think that was, that definitely altered my worldview as an organizer.
All right, so this individual who's speaking in this video is someone identified as Connor. I don't know what Connor's last name is or if that's his real name, but he has another quote. He said, "We were there in Cuba to learn the successes of the revolution and bring it back home with us. Keep in mind, the Armed Queers claim to abide by 6 principles. First principle is armed and militant protection of queer and trans communities, the end of capitalist oppression and exploitation, the creation of socialist society, trans liberation, and the abolition of prisons and police." That's what this group stands for. In July, there was a leader of the group that openly said, "We are a queer and trans-led Marxist-Leninist organization." Mike, I mean, what do you think of this?
Well, you pointed out some of the research that Data Republican put out just yesterday, and this dovetails with something I've been talking about for a very, very long time. Last year, when I was leading the crusade against the corruption at USAID, I would frequently point out how the transgender militancy has become a major tool of U.S. foreign policy. As we have lived in this era for the past decade of an undeclared second Cold War, not against left-wing communism, but against right-wing populism, in the same way that the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, USAID, all of their tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of grantee organizations and cutouts institutionally have tried to topple governments around the world or stop the rise of right-wing populist movements around the world, and this using the exact same levers of power that were done to stop left-wing communism during the Cold War, but this time to stop right-wing populism in Europe, in South America, in the United States, domestically. The LGBT, and particularly the T part of it, has become a major front in the same way that it's instructive to understand how the blueprint for this operates when you're trying to conduct a regime change or a people-powered bottom-up revolution in a country. What you try to do is you try to organize a coalition of the fringes, because you do not have the Democratic majority, because the only reason you activate these kind of mobs is because the State Department's preferred candidate did not win in a free and fair election. And so you need to destabilize the country and then have a minority of the voters oust the government in a violent, they call it a non-violent coup, but it's a violent coup. It is mobs of people on the streets burning police cars, burning buildings, and causing an evacuation of the elected president so that the power vacuum can be filled by the U.S. State Department's newly picked puppet. This is what was done in Bangladesh last year. This was done in Ukraine in 2014. This is what's done with our color revolution playbook. And as part of that, getting the coalition of fringes together, what the State Department looks for is the most radical, extreme groups with the highest risk tolerance and the largest grievances against the elected government, who are willing to take the risks of putting their bodies in the streets, of confronting police officers, of being willing to get arrested, and often who don't have a lot of means. So a little bit of bribe money in the form of US aid or State Department money goes a very, very long way. And so you have this transgender global affinity network that the State Department, USAID, the intelligence services have been working with. Really, I mean, especially since the end of the Cold War. A lot of this started in the early 1990s as the U.S. State Department was trying to achieve political vassalage control over Central and Eastern Europe after those countries were effectively ceded by the Soviet Union and were now up for a democratic vote, but there was still a lot of legacy, cultural and political affinity to the kind of Soviet Union paternalistic, heteronormative kind of machismo culture. And you see a lot of that in Central and Latin America as well. And so what you find is hundreds of millions of dollars of grants to these groups who then serve as boots on the ground. And it's not just the trans community, it's Antifa as well. Antifa is, a militant organization that is a global network and a global affinity network with partner cells at every civil society level, who serves as militant boots on the grounds to break up meetings, to assault or sometimes murder politicians who are rising in power. We saw this happen all over Europe with Antifa groups attacking political leaders in Spain, in Germany, in Italy, in France, and it's had the backing of the blob of our foreign policy establishment. They've been financed. They are constantly coordinating. In Syria, there were Antifa cells who were part of the CIA Operation Timber Sycamore network. When the CIA ran its then largest CIA operation in declassified history from 2011 to 2016, the operation to train Al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters to take down Bashar al-Assad, the Antifa networks were all over Syria as well. They had formal Antifa battalions who were State Department partners in that operation. And so you have these high risk tolerance radical groups. And, this is the sort of thing that was recruited on the right wing during the Cold War. If you look at, for example, the CIA memos from the 1980s about what to do in Nicaragua and El Salvador, where, the CIA would, publish memos about how to work with organized right-wing crime networks, and they would be the ones who would be willing to take to the streets, to use violence to achieve their means, who are willing to get arrested or potentially go out as a martyr in a gunfight or plant bombs or explosives. You hear this with operatives like Maria Stephan, who ran the Center for Nonviolent Action at the U.S. Institute of Peace, a government agency. And, I recently did a deep dive video on her work with the U.S. Institute of Mob Violence they call it peace, but it's complete violence. They literally advocate for property destruction and say property destruction does not count as violence.
Yeah,
because
that's what we heard the Black Lives Matter rioters, when they were committing arson and throwing rocks through windows and looting merchandise, they were like, oh, that's not violence. That's not a crime. That's just property. By the way, there's an Antifa connection to this Armed Queers Salt Lake City group. So that video that we showed of Connor, who was a member of Armed Queers, the guy in Cuba, talking about, if we're terrorists, then we're proud to be terrorists. The woman who was standing next to Connor in that video was the leader of the group. This is a woman named Ermaya Fanayan. She's the one who received the awards from the State Department affiliated NGO. So getting paid off as you described it before. But this same woman, so Armed Queers SLC, Salt Lake City, they co-hosted what they called educational workshops with the Elm Fork branch of the John Brown Gun Club. That is the trans Antifa perpetrators behind the July 4th ICE facility shooting in Texas. And Ermaya Fanayan, that same woman who's the leader of the Armed Queers group, the one that's in that video from Cuba, she appears to have promoted these so-called educational workshops on her private Instagram.
Yeah, it's all to be expected. You have this State Department Trantifa network. They serve as militant boots on the ground in Europe, in South America, in Asia. And I pointed this out. It's when you're talking about these networks, you even see Republican support for it. I pointed this out in Bangladesh, for example, last year when the Biden administration ousted the democratically elected prime minister in a coup, in a violent, people-powered, revolution. And what was happening was the State Department was funding their little CIA cutout groups like the National Endowment for Democracy. Documents leaked online, courtesy of the Gray Zone, who put out this fantastic reporting of the IRI, the International Republican Institute, which is the Republican wing of the National Endowment for Democracy, and their baseline assessment of the situation in Bangladesh and what options could be used by them with State Department money to destabilize the country, to bring it to its knees, because they did not expect to be able to win the next election of the State Department-backed candidate there through fair means. So they pursued a destabilization strategy. And a big part of that destabilization strategy was working with the transgender community in Bangladesh. Now, the interests in Bangladesh were constructing a U.S. military base and seizing the petroleum. And I mean, this was a Republican Chamber of Commerce operation. And yet you had Republicans spending millions of dollars on the Bangladeshi transgender community because they could be easily radicalized and serve as the boots on the ground fodder against the democratically elected government in Bangladesh. And so you had the IRI, which is a CIA front, that it's the Republican arm of NED, which was the brainchild of the CIA director, William Casey, in the 1980s. And its own founder said that they exist because groups become scandalized when they look like they're funded by the CIA. That's why our endowment was created. That's a direct quote to the New York Times in the 1980s when this group was started. It was run by John McCain for 25 years, and Mitt Romney's on the board of directors, for what it's worth. So every Republican until Trump has had to move through this group in order to become president. But the fact is you had them funding transgender dance festivals, transgender education clinics, transgender music and cultural events. You had them juicing the financial funnel of the entire network through all these different, philanthropic or arts and cultural styled names. But what you're doing is you're paying the people, you're paying the organizers. Right. I think this was in Amaryllis, Fox Kennedy's, biography that her cover when she was at the CIA was as an art student. So a lot of this happens through this kind of cultural vector, which is just paying political operatives under a civilian front in order to do destabilization work and to counter through often terroristic means, whatever it takes, by any means necessary, as they say, to stop populist support for any sort of movement that challenges the U.S. State Department. So I think in addition to all the current foreign assistance cuts that are happening on censorship grounds or on waste, fraud, and corruption grounds, I think a full review of all of the funding to these transgender identity-based groups. I mean, some of this was sick. What the Biden administration was doing is sometimes the grants would just be as naked as being LGBT. They would just give out money for being LGBT in the Caribbean. I think there's like a $3 million grant just for one I found as an example. It was just as naked as that, just being LGBT.
Like, go be gay on the beach and Biden will give you money.
Right, but what you're doing is you're paying the organizers. This is like when we say we're doing food relief in Somalia. We're just paying warlords. And what you're doing is you're paying these Antifa warlords to organize.
And like, what better group? If you think about the transgender ideology, I mean, I've talked about this a lot. Transgender ideology is queer theory. If you read queer theory, it is an inherently violent, revolutionary Marxist ideology, and it captures the minds of vulnerable young people. Maybe they have gender dysphoria, maybe they don't, maybe they have autism, maybe they don't, maybe they have the anxiety and depression, maybe they don't. For whatever reason, when you're captured, when you're a vulnerable young person and you're captured by this ideology, it gives you this tension. It's the Marxist dialectic, right? You're going to be genocided. You're marginalized. You're oppressed. The only way to save your life is to overthrow the oppressors, capitalism and white men and Christians and America. It's an inherently violent Marxist ideology that harnesses pain and brokenness and mental illness in these young people, but it gives them this panic and this fear that if they don't...
And dependency. It is expensive to maintain the treatments over a lifetime. There is a dependency on the money to keep flowing. There's a dependency on the institutions to support you. There's a dependency on a centralized government in order to, protect what the hegemony or the privileged position from any sort of a cultural or social attack vector. And so this is how you have this kind of transjanissary phenomenon. Where that community in particular is a very loyal servant of the blob on foreign policy grounds. And so when you see, for example, the head of Armed Queers Salt Lake City receiving accolades from State Department NGOs and the United Nations for the Sustainable Development Goals, which, by the way, that's a multinational corporation project that secures profits for big businesses in the energy and agriculture and minerals spaces. But you have these kind of armed boots on the ground, groups in the form of these kind of, transjanissary groups, and who readily declare that they are for an armed revolution. I saw one of the banners for Armed Queers that said the revolution will not be voted in. This is imagine this, and I tweeted this out, and I said there's one thing faster than the speed of light, and that's the speed at which the FBI would descend on a right-wing gun group who called for an armed revolution as opposed to voting.
Can you even imagine? I honestly can't. I mean, you can look back. The left is always liking to point back to January 6th, and I actually think it's apropos in this scenario, because these people on January 6th, many of whom just walked peacefully into the Capitol because someone ushered them in. The Capitol Police let them in. The gates and were already moved. They were charged as terrorists because they thought something fishy happened in the 2020 election. And yet we have these trans groups that are articulating their desire to train for the violent overthrow of the United States. They are celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and there's very weird and suspicious, I would call it circumstantial evidence. The FBI, I know, is investigating to investigate whether there's proof of it, but there's at very least circumstantial evidence that there was foreknowledge on the part of some people in some groups of this hideous crime that was committed. I mean, the amount of rage that I feel that our government has, they haven't just let us down. They're not incompetent. That they have created this scenario is unbelievable. And we are at the point now, this is the biggest test that members of the Trump administration, cabinet members, that members of Congress, that the president and the vice president themselves will face. What are we going to do to stop this? That's what we're going to talk about next. Mike Benz, I know that you have to go, so thank you for joining us today. You're welcome back anytime. We appreciate your investigative research all the time.
Thank you, Liz. And just as a final point, I just note that what we're talking about here is incitement to violence, which is a very different, it's unseemly when you see left-wing political figures, tarnish, Charlie's reputation or legacy, but that's all fair game. You don't have to love someone, when, even if they're murdered in a horrific way. It's tasteless to do it, I think, within the 1-2 week or 1 month, whatever period. But that's not what, I'm directing solutions. Or it's when you're talking about incitement to violence, when you have these statements like, okay, Andy No next, Matt Walsh next.
Yes.
When you have, and when you say it was a good thing that someone was, violently executed and there should be more of it. These kind of things, when you are endorsing political assassination, which is a very different thing than saying I didn't like the guy. As tasteless as that may be, we do play by the rules on this side of the political movement.
That's exactly
aisle. Right. But those rules have to be enforced. When they cross the line to incitement, there has to be consequences.
That's right. There's also a difference between societal repercussions and legal accountability.
Yes.
I'm 100% on board with those who are celebrating, saying, oh, I didn't like Charlie Kirk, he got what's coming, whatever. Those are horrendous things to say. And I'm all on board. Call the school, call their parents, call their job, make them socially ostracized. It's time to make that kind of language socially unacceptable, even if it's not a crime. But there are many, many comments, as you said, that are inciting violence. These are threats. This is not First Amendment protected speech. And we're going to talk about that because Attorney General Pam Bondi made a comment about prosecuting hate speech. She got a lot of flack for it from both the right and the left, and she clarified what she meant. I want to talk about some of the solutions and what we should demand when it comes to not only justice for Charlie, but to dismantle the institutional threat that we're now seeing very plainly is aimed right at us. Mike, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Liz.